chain of events, cause and effect. We analyze what went right and what went wrong, as we discover that many outcomes can be predicted, planned for, and even prevented. I'm John Chidgey, and this is Causality. This episode of Causality is brought to you by Sapient Pair and their iOS app, Shopi. Shopi is a free collaborative shopping list app that's simple and easy to use, and we'll talk more about them during the show. Causality is part of the Engineered Network. For other great shows, visit engineered.network today. This episode, I'd like to talk about a very famous disaster, the Titanic. It was thought to be by the vast, general populace, I suppose, that it was a boat that couldn't sink. So when it sank on its maiden voyage, no less, there seemed to be a lot of dark romanticism surrounding it. I suppose the most attractive thing about the Titanic as a disaster is the hubris surrounding our ability to build, or think we could build, an unsinkable ship. Or at least that's the trope. Of course, you can't build an unsinkable ship. You can't build an uncrashable car, a train that can't be derailed, a plane that can't crash, or a bicycle that can't crash. So all you can do is, make it as safe as possible for its occupants in the case that there is an incident. And, as unlikely as possible for it to get you into an accident or incident in the first place. And there's a long laundry list of things that contributed to the sinking of the Titanic. And I'm not going to cover them all. It's been done and redone. Rather, I want to focus on two key points, ones that I think are key. But before we do, let's just talk a little bit about the RMS Titanic. RMS, by the way, stands for Royal Mail Ship, which indicates that she undertook mail service on behalf of the Royal Mail. As a ship, it took 3 years to construct, used 3 million steel rivets. It was 269 meters, that's 882 feet long. At the time, it was the largest man-made moving object on the Earth. Now today, that's December 2015, the largest passenger vessel is now the MS Allure of the Seas, and it is 362 meters long. That's 1,188 feet. In the grand scheme of things, that is bigger, but really not as much bigger as you'd think. The Titanic was a very large ship. It had 29 steam boilers. They used 825 tons of coal every day just to keep them running. The coal was all hand-shoveled into the furnaces by a team of 176 men. Part of the design included 16 watertight compartments. They went as high as F-deck. But importantly, as we'll see later, they were not sealed on top. The Titanic was 92 feet wide and it had 9 decks. The maximum capacity was 3,547 people. The lifeboats, there were 20, broken down into 14 regular lifeboats, 4 Engelhardt collapsible canvas boats, and 2 emergency lifeboats. Interestingly, the total lifeboat capacity was only 1,178 people. Breaking that down, regular lifeboat could handle 65 people. Emergency lifeboat was 40, and the collapsible canvas boats were 47 people apiece. So what is the timeline? On April the 11th, 1912, at 1:30 p.m., the Titanic left Queenstown Island, now called Cobe, and heads across the Atlantic for New York, having picked up passengers both there and from Cherbourg, France, the previous day. On April 12th, 13th, 1912, the Titanic continues on the journey as passengers are enjoying their life on this beautiful, luxurious ship. And it was luxurious. They spared no expense fitting it out. On April the 14th, though, that's when things started to go wrong. At 9:20 p.m., Captain Smith retired to his room. 20 minutes later, the last of several warnings about icebergs was received in the wireless room. However, that final warning never made it to the bridge. That said, previous warnings had been received. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts spot an iceberg directly in the path of the Titanic. First Officer Murdoch orders a hard starboard, otherwise known as a left-hand turn, but the Titanic's right side still scrapes the side of the iceberg. Only 37 seconds pass between the sighting of the iceberg and the collision. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith orders the crew to prepare the lifeboats and get the passengers and crew up on deck. 40 minutes later, the first lifeboat is lowered into the freezing water. The sinking of the Titanic started at the front. As the front of the ship sank, it caused a large amount of stress along the length of the ship. It was never designed to handle that sort of stress, where the rear end of the boat was literally lifting out of the water. And this caused the Titanic to snap in half at 2:18 a.m. 2 minutes after it snapped in half, the Titanic was essentially completely submerged. 4:10 a.m. in the morning, the Carpathia picks up the first of the survivors from the lifeboats. And by 8:30 in the morning, they had picked up the final survivors from the final lifeboat. On April 17th, the Mackay Bennett is the first of several ships to travel to the area where the Titanic sank to search for bodies. Finally, October the 18th, the Carpathia finally arrives in New York with 705 survivors. If you look at the history of ships that have sunk due to icebergs, it's key to point out that there have been about just five, in the last 100 years. And almost all of those incidents occurred before there were better warning systems. As a direct result of the Titanic, the International Ice Patrol was formed in 1914 to detect, advise, and disseminate detailed tracking information about sea ice and ice pack during the year. The night the Titanic was struck, the sea was calm, and that made it very difficult to spot icebergs. Ordinarily, wash from the ocean would, wash up on the side of them, and you'd make them much easier to see. For reasons unexplained, the crow's nest didn't have any binoculars, which was, a bit stupid, but it certainly didn't help that the moon also wasn't out that night. It was just starlight. Now, there had been warnings, and several had made it to the bridge, but unfortunately, some didn't. The last one didn't either. The route that they were taking at that time of year was bound to have icebergs, so you can reasonably expect that there would have been some, and they should have been, perhaps a little bit more concerned than they were. But that's really not that interesting to me. If we accept that being hit by an iceberg is inevitable on a large ocean liner at some point, the far better question, more interesting question, is how do we guard against that? How do we prepare ourselves for that outcome? And in the case of the Titanic, why did so many people die? So the two that I want to dive into are lifeboats, or lack thereof, claims of it being unsinkable because, quote-unquote, bulkheads. So let's start with the bulkheads. In 1910, the White Star Line published a brochure about their sister ships, the Olympic and the Titanic, in which they stated, "As far as it is possible to do so, these two wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable." In 1911, an edition of the Shipbuilder magazine stated, "The captain can, by simply moving an electric switch, close the watertight doors throughout and make the vessel practically unsinkable." Now, it's interesting because it wasn't just some of the publicity materials, although actually the origin of that quote from the brochure was debated. The truth is that the Shipbuilder magazine did say practically unsinkable, and that has definitely been traced back to that original magazine. But it wasn't just those statements. You have to understand that there were also similarly designed ships around that time that had the bulkheads, that had the watertight compartments, and there was a belief that this method of separating out the hull was going to be a significant advantage in reducing the rate, if not eliminating the fact that the ship could sink. And an example of this that fed this myth that it would be unsinkable because of its design was something that happened on the RMS Republic As one example, but perhaps the most pertinent. That happened on the 23rd of January in 1909. Now, the RMS Republic collided with the SS Florida in dense fog, and whilst it did begin to sink initially, the bulkhead design stopped the ship from sinking any further immediately prior to the incident. But 7 boats responded to the incident, and while 6 people were killed at the moment of impact, no one actually drowned because the ship didn't sink while there were still people on it. And all 1,500 or so remaining passengers were transferred off the stricken vessel in time. The following day, though, while it was being towed back to port, eventually it did sink as the bulkheads gave way. But that incident fed the perception, and there were a few other similar ones, that these designs, the bulkhead designs, made ships of this sort unsinkable, from the point of view that everyone could be evacuated well in time before it sank. That's if it sank at all. So, there were several other similar incidents, as I said, with not so many people involved, smaller ships and boats. The design of the Olympic and the Titanic were just like the Republic, just larger, and it incorporated those bulkheads as an integral part of the hull. Now, there were 15 bulkhead doors, and that made a total of 16 compartments. There were 3 mechanisms that you could use to lower the bulkheads. There was a remote switch from the bridge that they talked about in the Shipbuilder magazine. Very proud of that switch. There were float switches in each compartment, and there was a manual lever mechanism on the door as a mechanical override. So the design meant that the ship could stay afloat even if 2 of the compartments were completely flooded. But because equipment and storage rooms and second-class cabins and above were getting in the way, the bulkheads extended to about 5 meters above the waterline when the boat was fully laden. That works out to about F deck. Essentially, that meant the G deck, the all-up deck, and obviously all the boilers, coal storage, and everything, they were all below the waterline. So when the iceberg gouged a 300 feet section of the Titanic's hull, that's 92-meter section, it pierced a total of 6 compartments. Large amounts of water were flowing into 3 of them. And the thing to remember is it wasn't a single gouge. It was actually 6 separate gouges. 3 of them were only about 5 to 10 meters long. The largest was nearly 40 meters long. But it wasn't just one gouge. There's been a theory kicked around by some scientists who have been studying the disaster. And their conclusion was rather interesting. They suggested that the bulkheads may have in fact made this worse. And the reason I say this is because if there had been no bulkheads, if there no compartments at all, and the same gouges had occurred, the incoming water into the hull would have spread out far more evenly between the front and the back of the hull. What that would have meant is that the boat would not have, in fact, sunk more in the front at such a fast rate. Hence, the back of the boat would also be dragged down as it slowly filled with water. What that would mean is that the boat wouldn't do a nosedive down into the ocean, because as it dived down, the water was able to actually, essentially pull the hull out of the water and caused it to snap. And as soon as that happened, it was the water just flooded in and it was down within minutes. So one of the theories that goes around is the compartments actually did make them worse. It would have sunk a lot slower, perhaps, without them. And in some more recent simulations, they suggested it could have remained afloat for as much as another 6 hours. Now, we know what time the Carpathia arrived. We could probably reasonably assume that those people would have been saved had it been afloat for 6 hours because the Carpathia responded within that time. Since the Titanic, designs for double hulls have been the preference, where compartments are employed. They extend much higher than in the hull than the original design of the Titanic. Ultimately, though, the design of the compartments, perhaps it wasn't really necessarily a bad idea. You could argue perhaps it was poorly executed. One of the other parts of it that was poorly executed was the fact that these sections, these bulkheads, they only covered the X and Y axis. There was no seal over the top of them. They were not watertight insofar as they were a box of air, like a pontoon. They weren't like that at all. They were simply doors in the hull. and they were completely open on top. So water could simply go over the top. And that's exactly what it did as it sank. So ultimately, no, it wasn't a bad idea, no. But perhaps it was poorly executed. And design experience since then has told us that double hulls are a better option. Oh, yeah, and if you're going to have bulkheads, they should probably go up higher too. Before we go any further, I'd just like to talk about our sponsor for this episode, and that's Sapient Pair. And they decided, after years of being frustrated with to-do list apps when they were shopping, to create an iOS app for the iPhone. It's called Shopi. Now, there's lots of to-do lists out there that people use for shopping lists, and I've used a lot of them. They're not that great. It's because going shopping is a very special use case for a list, and an app tuned for actually making and shopping from that list can do a far better job than any to-do list can. And if you're shopping for more than just yourself, Shopi can really help you out. It's collaborative, and it's simple and easy to use. I picked it up and I instinctively knew how to use it. It's not cluttered with lots of options. It doesn't presume you live in a specific country or present you with a list of 100 brands of butter or milk to choose from. Just type in what you want and that's your list. It remembers the products you've typed in for future lists that you create, and you can even order the list that you prefer to check them off in. No fussing around assigning items to aisles and sections. It's cool enough that you can then share your list with your spouse, your partner, your family, and they can add, mark off, reorder items as they need to. Changes to the list on one device will show up pretty much instantly on other devices that are sharing that list. It's really fast. When you go shopping from a shared list, just tap the Go Shopping button, and everyone who's sharing that list will get a notification. Shopi will tell from your phone's GPS and let them know what shop you're shopping at and give you the chance to add any of those last-minute items that you want your spouse or partner to get. Shopi will even turn off Go Shopping automatically when you leave the shop if you forget. I also love the pocket lock feature. If you're security conscious and you've got a passcode set, there's nothing more annoying than having to lock your phone, slip it in your pocket, and get it back out again at the end of the aisle just to unlock it again so you can look at your list. Well, Pocket Lock disables the screen when it detects that it's in your pocket or your bag, and it re-enables it when it's removed. There's no passcode, no touch ID, no fuss. It's great. My wife and I have used it so much now, it's become a verb. The other day she asked me to Shopi her a list of things to buy. Seriously. We don't need those last minute, is there anything else you need while I'm at the shops phone calls anymore because we have Shopi. Now, Shopi's free to try for the first month, after which it becomes ad supported. There's no risk, there's no loss of functionality. If you want to help out the developer, though, you can in-app purchase a 3 or 12-month ad removal for $1.99 or $4.99 US respectively. And if you subscribe during the month of December, it's on special for just 99 cents and $2.99 respectively. Now, please visit this URL, Sapient, that's SAPIENT -pair, PAIR.com/engineered, and follow the links to the App Store from there to help out the show. You need to follow that URL if you want to help out the show. So thanks again to Sapient Pair and Shopi for sponsoring Causality and the Engineered Network. Let's talk about the lifeboats now. I always thought it was so odd, as did a lot of people, that there were only 16 lifeboats and 4 small collapsible boats for some 2,228 passengers and crew. 16 of the 20 lifeboats were used in the emergency, loading between about 20 to 1 and 10 past 2 in the morning. 2 of the collapsible boats floated away in the final minutes before the ship sank. Many of the lifeboats were filled to significantly less than their maximum capacity, and in some cases at only half capacity. Had every lifeboat been filled, they could only have evacuated 53% of the people on that ship. But the shortage of lifeboats wasn't actually due to a lack of space. During the design stages of the Titanic, Alexander Carlisle, Harland & Wolff's chief draftsman and general manager, submitted a plan to the White Star Line to provide 64 lifeboats in the Titanic's original design. The reasons aren't exactly clear, but the figure was actually later reduced by half to 32. Once again, in March 2010, it was reduced again by another half to only 16. The cost of an extra 32 lifeboats, let's say, would have only been $16,000 at the time, which represents overall 0.2% of the overall cost of the Titanic, which was about $7.5 million. So if it was a cost saving, it really wasn't a very good cost saving. The British Board of Trade devised a bunch of safety regulations for merchant vessels of the time, and they were updated several times, but most significantly with the passage of the Merchant Shipping Act in 1894. The Act and regulations at the time of Titanic's construction required a vessel of 10,000 tons or more to carry 16 lifeboats, with a total capacity of 9,625 cubic feet, which is 272.5 cubic meters. That would be sufficient for 960 people. However, the original tonnage limitations, they were for a ship that's less than a quarter of the mass of the Titanic, and that would kind of make them, well, woefully inadequate. It would be an understatement. Anyway, the inquiry also revealed the White Star Line wanted fewer boats on the decks to provide unobstructed views for the passengers, and that would give the ship more aesthetics, I suppose, from an exterior view and the enjoyment of their passengers. It'd be a lot less cluttered. I mean, who's going to need lifeboats, right? The area that was free of lifeboats, and no surprises, it was the first-class promenade. As a result of what happened on the Titanic, on March the 4th, 1915, United States President Woodrow Wilson signed the Lafayette's Seamen's Act of 1915, in which it provided that all ocean-going ships be equipped with lifeboats for 75% of passengers, the remainder to be provided collapsible rafts. In other words, everyone on board got a boat of some kind. The wreck of the Titanic. It was discovered on the 1st of September 1985 by a Franco-American expedition led by Robert Ballard. Its final resting place is 370 miles, that's 600 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland, at a depth of 12,500 feet. That's 3.8 kilometers down. It's a very sorry story. And as I said at the beginning, it's been very romanticized. There have been lots of movies made about it. But for me, the key learning with the Titanic is that risk perception can be driven by emotion and a misinterpretation of the facts. Every ship that's built has to be designed to handle a complete evacuation, and not just ship to lifeboat, but ship to ship as well. The assumptions that they made during the design, let's just go through them. First assumption is a large number of ships in a well-trafficked, busy shipping lane meant rescue times would be short. Now, actually, the funny thing is that turned out to be relatively true. 4 hours and 30 minutes before the first ship arrived to help. So short, yes, but not short enough. The bulkhead design potentially made the sinking rate worse. A double hull design would have been better, but higher bulkheads would have been better. Fully sealable compartments, better again. The reduction in the number of lifeboats was based on flawed assumptions surrounding the sinking rate and the rescue times. The regulations also didn't keep up with the technology. They were building enormous ships. It was more than 4 times the size of the one that they had in mind when they wrote the legislation. And I mean, that's sadly common. It's a common problem. And sometimes it takes incidents like this to push legislation forward. It shouldn't, but it does. The saddest part about it is that the original design had, legally speaking, the right quantity of lifeboats. It had been legislated that way, and White Star Line had it been legislated to have a full 64, or even if it met the updated act in 1915, then the White Star Line would have had no option but to add them. But because the regulations didn't, they chose not to. And that's why we legislate these things. Because if we didn't, well. So whenever we build any vessel, any building, any room, anything that contains people at one point or another, we have to understand evacuations and we have to push our assumptions. We can't rely on the idea that incidents are unlikely. We have to approach it from the perspective that incidents will happen and we need to be prepared for them when they do. keeping rescue equipment in good working order, training people how to use them properly, practicing evacuation drills. These are all critical components that need to be done regularly, thoroughly, because if they're not, someday, maybe not today, maybe not even tomorrow or even the next month, but someday, when it does all go wrong, people can die. I'd like to thank Sapient Pair and their iOS app Shopi for sponsoring the Engineered Network and Causality. If you're going shopping and want a great collaborative shopping list app, then Shopi can help you out. It's ad-free for the first month. Check it out at sapient-pair.com/engineered. This was Causality. I'm John Chidgey. Thanks for listening.